This is part one of a lecture on macromolecules from Bio 101 from Wednesday, September 16th, 2020. And in this lecture, we're going to talk first about the four elements that make up most of these, almost all organic molecules or macromolecules. We're going to talk about the four different categories of macromolecules, as well as their subunits or monomers. Going to talk about some of the functions of each category of these macromolecules, and then some more specific details about both carbohydrates, lipids, proteins, and nucleic acids. And so to get started, first I just want to define what an organic molecule is. And so an organic or a biological molecule is any type of molecule containing both carbon and hydrogen atoms. And if you remember from the last lecture, a molecule is a two or more atoms or elements held together by bonds. And so an organic molecule is two or more elements held together by bonds, and those elements have to include carbon and they have to include hydrogen. And so in addition to carbon and hydrogen, organic molecules are mostly composed of these two elements as well as oxygen and nitrogen. And these four elements are what comprise most of the organic matter, so people, animals, plants that we see on Earth is only made up of these four different types of elements or these four different atoms, arranged in different ways to make different organic molecules. And one specific type of organic molecule is what are known as macromolecules, or very large molecules. And since these macromolecules are so large, they're often made up of many repeating subunits. And each one of these subunits is called a monomer. And when you put a bunch of monomers together to make a larger molecule, it's what's known as a polymer. Right? And so in terms of the macromolecules we're going to talk about today, proteins are the macromolecules or the polymers that are made up of many subunits or monomers of amino acids. And those amino acids join together to make a protein. Monomers join together to form polymers. So you can see the four categories of macromolecules that we find in cells here, and both the polymer form of each of these categories as well as the subunit or the monomer form. And so the four major categories are carbohydrates, lipids, or the fats, proteins, and nucleic acids. The polymers of carbohydrates are what are known as polysaccharides, and they are made up of subunits called monosaccharides. The polymers of lipids are fats, and their subunits are glycerols and fatty acids. The polymer of the protein macromolecules are polypeptides, and they're made up of subunits called amino acids. And DNA and RNA are the polymers of nucleic acids, and they're made up of subunits or monomers called nucleotides. And we're going to go through each of these classes individually in the next portion of the lecture. Starting with the carbohydrates, or the sugars. And so the function of carbohydrates, one function that you may have already thought of and definitely know in terms of thinking about carbohydrates from a dietary perspective, is that they function as a source of energy. So you can see some carbohydrates up here, right? We've got bread, rice, starchy vegetables like potatoes, pasta, as well as the sugars in fruit. All of these are carbohydrates, and all of them can serve as an energy source for us. But carbohydrates can also provide some structure or building materials for different organisms. They make up the cell walls of bacteria and plants, as well as the exoskeletons of some bugs and crustaceans like crabs. And there are three varieties of carbohydrates we're going to talk about in the next couple slides. The monosaccharides, or those monomers that make up carbohydrates, disaccharides, and polysaccharides, which are your polymers. And so a monosaccharide is one single sugar molecule. Mono means one, and saccharin, or sac, is Latin for sugar. So a monosaccharide is a single sugar molecule. And you sometimes would hear these referred to as simple sugars or simple carbohydrates, at least when we're talking about nutrition and diet. They have a backbone, or they're made up of 3 to 7 carbon atoms. And there are some different examples of monosaccharides listed here. You don't need to know which ones are hexoses, which ones are pentoses. You don't need to know all of these examples, but it's important just to illustrate the variety of monosaccharides or monomers of carbohydrates out there. And so some of the hexoses, or the 6 carbon sugars, are glucose, which is considered blood sugar, as well as fructose, which is the sugar found in most fruits. And then pentoses, or the 5 carbon sugars, are these ribose and deoxyribose, which are the sugars in nucleic acids like DNA and RNA. And we'll talk more about that when we get to the nucleic acid portion of the lecture. But monosaccharides are your subunits, they're your simple sugars. And you can see an image of monosaccharides here, right? And so this is a glucose molecule that has 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6 carbons. And it's one single subunit or one single 6-carbon hexagon. Once again, you don't need to know the structures of these molecules for the purposes of this class. They're just sort of to illustrate a point. So if you take 2 monosaccharides, for example, 2 glucoses, and put them together and create a bond between those 2 monosaccharides, you create what's known as a disaccharide, or 2 sugars put together. And some examples of disaccharides that you're likely familiar with are lactose, sucrose, and maltose. So lactose is the sugar found in milk. It is a disaccharide made up of 1 monomer of glucose and 1 monomer of galactose, which is also a monosaccharide. And just kind of an interesting aside, there's an enzyme that can actually break down lactose into glucose and galactose. And that's the enzyme that individuals who are lactose intolerant actually lack, right? So they can't break down the milk sugar into its components, glucose and galactose, and they're intolerant to lactose as a result. Another disaccharide is sucrose, which is a glucose monomer and a fructose or fruit sugar monomer put together. This is the type of sugar you would have on your table, the type of sugar you put in your coffee. And maltose, which is 2 glucose monomers put together, is the sugars found in beer. And you can actually continue to add monosaccharides or monomers to a carbohydrate until it becomes very, very large. And a polymer that's made up of more than 2 monosaccharides, many monosaccharides, in fact, is known as a polysaccharide. Poly being many, saccharide being sugar. Polysaccharides are also what we sometimes call, in terms of at least nutrition and diet, the complex carbohydrates. Some examples of the complex carbs can be seen down here, and they have a function in energy storage. The first is starch, which you can actually see in this image up top, and the second is glycogen, which you can see in this image on the bottom. And as you can see, there's 1 single glucose hexagon here, and then in order to make a starch molecule, many hexagons or many glucoses are strung together into this complex structure. The same is true for glycogen. And if you looked at those 2 things, they look pretty similar, right? It's a lot of glucoses all strung together. And both of these molecules are also involved in storage of energy. There is one major difference, however, between starch and glycogen, and that's the organisms that use both of them. So starch is for energy storage within plants, like potatoes. Glycogen is for energy storage in animals. And so you've likely seen starch when you cut a potato and there's sort of that milky substance on your knife, or when you soak rice or pasta in water and you can see that the water gets cloudy. That's actually the starch left over from these different plants. We as animals cannot make or store starch. We make and store glycogen for our energy storage carbohydrate, and we store it within the liver. And so a lot of our energy stores are in that organ in the form of glycogen. And in addition to an energy storage function, these complex carbs or polysaccharides can also have structural functions. One of the first structural carbohydrates I'm going to talk about is chitin, and we've already talked about chitin before. It makes up the cell walls of fungi, like mushrooms, And it also makes up the exoskeletons of certain animals. So the exoskeletons of insects, as well as exoskeletons of crustaceans like crabs and lobsters. Peptidoglycan is another complex carbohydrate, and that makes up the cell walls of bacteria and other prokaryotes. And finally, cellulose is a complex carbohydrate or a polysaccharide that makes up the cell walls of plants. And cellulose, because plants have been so successful on Earth, is actually the most abundant organic molecule on Earth. What is interesting about cellulose, however, is that animals, including humans, can't digest it. And so you may have seen cellulose before when you have a piece of celery and you get that kind of stringy, those little strings left behind. Those are made up of cellulose. And sometimes we also will see cellulose listed on the ingredients list of our packaging as dietary fiber. And because we can't digest cellulose or fiber, it's used as a way to kind of move things through the digestive system, right? And so not only are sugars important for energy storage, but they're also important for these cell wall structures over a variety of different organisms.